Welcome to Talks at Google. I'm Marc, and I'm here with Paul Smith, who's
Hi.
a best-selling author of a few books, in fact. Lead with a Story is one that I read recently, and it was very popular. Also, Parenting with a Story. I haven't read that yet, but I have kids, so I plan to read it soon.
Good.
Paul spent a couple of years as a consultant at Accenture and 20 years at Procter & Gamble as a director of consumer communications research. He's a popular keynote speaker. He's been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Inc. magazine, Times, Forbes, Success magazine, a lot of big publications. So Paul, thanks a lot for joining us.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's good to be here.
Yeah, great. So tell us a little bit about this book, Sell with a Story, that you just wrote.
Yeah, so well, as you can tell, it's kind of the third in a series. I guess I didn't really know when I started I was going to write a trilogy, I guess it is, but it kind of worked out that way. But they're all about how to use storytelling to make you more effective at whatever it is that you're doing. So the first one obviously is to help you be a better leader, the second one to be a more effective parent, and this one obviously to be more effective at selling. And that is not just if you're selling a thing, a product, or it could be a service, or it could just be your ideas. A lot of us are trafficking in ideas. So even if that's just making a presentation to your boss or making a recommendation around the office, that kind of thing. So it's to use storytelling to help you be more effective at that.
Yeah, great. Well, I could definitely use that. I'm in sales myself, so I've read the book and I found some nice tidbits there.
Good.
What exactly is storytelling for business? Tell us more about how a salesperson can use storytelling.
Yeah, well, so I think that word storytelling has been used a lot lately for things that it probably was never intended to be used for. 15 or 20 years ago, when somebody were to say a story, you would know exactly what they meant. But these days, I think people use it for different things. Nowadays you'll hear people say, "Oh, our marketing plan's a story," or our new copy on air tells a story, or our mission statement tells a story, or our brand logo is a story, And if people can get some extra meaning in their work by calling those things stories, then that's great. But they're probably not really stories. There's a difference. Not every set of words that has meaning is a story. Just like not every set of words that's entertaining is a poem. I mean, their story is something different. So when I say storytelling, I actually mean telling a story about something that happened to somebody. I don't just mean making a compelling speech or writing a great memo. In fact, imagine, so you're in sales, so imagine it's next week, you're sitting down in a meeting to prepare for a sales call that you've got coming up with a new prospective client, and the boss comes in to get the meeting started and says, "Okay, let's get this meeting started. What's our story?" Do you think for a minute that what that person means is story in the traditional sense? Probably not. What they probably mean is, what's the logical series of facts and data and arguments that we're going to put together, probably in a PowerPoint presentation, that we're going to essentially read to the client or the prospect such that by the end of the meeting we have the best odds of success at selling something. That's what they mean by a story. And that's great because you need that when you're going into a sales call. But we wouldn't have called that 20 years ago a story. We would have called that a sales pitch or presentation slides or a message track or talking points or something. So I'm not talking about talking points or message tracks or sales pitches. I'm talking about actual stories. In fact, it might help if I gave you an example.
Sure.
Right, yeah. So last year, and this is one that actually happened to me personally. So last summer, my wife and I were at an art fair, and she was looking for a piece of art for our son's bathroom at home. And so we're going booth to booth, and we get to this booth of this one artist. He's an underwater photographer. His name's Chris Goog, and he just does these mesmerizing underwater shots of sea anemones and sea turtles and coral reefs and stuff like that. And she gets attached to this one picture that to me looked about as out of place as a pig in the ocean, right? Because it was literally a pig in the ocean, a picture of a pig in the ocean. And I just thought that was the craziest thing. And eventually I got my turn to ask a question of the photographer, and I said, "Dude, what's with the pig in the ocean," right? And that is when the magic started. I mean, he said, "Oh yeah, it was the craziest thing." He said, "That picture was taken in the Bahamas off the coast of this uninhabited island called Big Major Cay." And he said, apparently what happened was a few years ago, a local entrepreneur decided to raise a pig farm for bacon, I guess. And so he goes and buys this whole drove of pigs, and he puts them out on this island where he can keep them for free. And he said, and he points to the picture and goes, "But look up there behind the pig on the beach." And he said, "Right behind the beach, what kind of vegetation do you see up there?" And I looked and I kind of squinted and I said, "Well, the only thing I recognize are cactus. And he said, yeah, that's a problem. Pigs don't like cactus. He said these poor pigs weren't thriving, right? They couldn't eat. It's hard to eat a cactus, right? And fortunately for them, they quickly noticed that a local restaurant owner on a neighboring island was boating his kitchen refuse every night over to Big Major K and dumping it a few dozen yards offshore. So pretty soon, these hungry little pigs smell the food, and they're hungry enough that they brave the ocean waters and eventually figure out how to get out there and get the food. First one pig, then two, and now it's 2 or 3 generations later, and all the pigs on Big Major K can swim. So, and he said, in fact, now nobody even calls it Big Major K anymore. Everybody calls it Pig Island, right? So for those of you that have heard of it, if you ever go to the Caribbean, go check out Pig Island, and then there are these pigs, and they swim. And he said, in fact, I didn't even have to get out of my boat. Like normally I have to put on all this scuba gear and wetsuit and stuff, and it takes hours to get my pictures. He said, when I got to Big Major K, I just leaned over and stuck my camera out of the water because the pigs swim right up to the boat. Yeah, because they think they're going to get fed, right? They've learned that boats mean food, right? Right. So anyway, of course, at that point, I've got my credit card out, and I'm like, we'll take it. Right. I totally sold that picture. And
so the story made all the difference.
Of course it did, right? I mean, 2 minutes earlier, that picture was worth nothing to me. But after hearing that short 2-minute story, I was like, I got to have this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And why? Because now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. And it's a story I get to tell everybody that comes into my house. And it's also an animal psychology lesson, a history lesson, a geography lesson, all kind of rolled into one, right? It's just an interesting story. So that's, when I say a sales story, that's what I mean. I don't mean, Paul, here are the 3 reasons why you got to buy this picture. It is the right size for your bathroom. It's the right color palette for your towels, and and it's priced just right. I mean,
so a difference between logic and emotion in a purchasing decision, I imagine.
Right. Yeah. Most sales pitches are very logical, and quite frankly, they're a list. It's a list of the reasons why you should buy this. Okay. I'm not talking about sales lists. Sales stories or something very different like that. And that, by the way, that's just one type of story. I mean, there's 20 some odd types of sales stories that I talk about in the book. That particular one is what I call a value-adding story. It's a story that makes the thing that you're selling more valuable, right? But there are lots of other kinds as well.
So how would a salesperson come up with stories like this? What's the formula for that? I think you talked about that in the book.
Yeah, so first of all, be observant, right? I mean, that thing actually happened to me at that art fair, and it made an impression on me, so I remembered it, right? So the first thing you've got to do is to recognize that what you need as a salesperson is a repertoire of stories to tell. So when you see a story happen or hear a great story, don't just enjoy it and let it pass through your brain. Recognize that's something important. Like if it moved you in some way, it will move other people when you tell them. So collect it just like you would.
Write it down in a journal.
Yeah, just like you would a fact or an interesting argument or a good piece of analysis or a super compelling piece of data. Like if you heard that during your workday, you go, oh, I'm going to write that down. I need that. Right? You should be thinking of that way about stories as well, but you can be more intentional about it too. Like I recommend people, in the back of the book is the list of here are the 25 types of sales stories that you probably need. Go find them. Like intentionally go on a story hunt. And it might take you 6 months to do it, to find all the right ones, but ask other people, to tell people, here are the stories I'm looking for. Just like you would do if you were to tell your colleagues, hey, I need data on this, or I'm looking for this type of analysis, or has anybody had this type of experience? Do the same things with your stories. I'm looking for this kind of a story, and eventually you'll get your list of 25 filled out, and you'll be in a better position.
Do you recommend using a story every time you have a sales meeting?
Well, probably, but I should clarify the type of storytelling I'm talking about is not just to be used during the sales pitch. Right. The people that I interviewed for the book, and I interviewed people at 50 or 60 different companies around the world, professional salespeople and professional buyers, by the way, professional procurement people, because I figured who better to tell you what sales stories work and which ones don't than the buyers, right? In fact, I'm convinced now that I learned more from the buyers than I did the sellers.
Tell me a little bit about how you did all those interviews. You just contacted buyers all over the place. Were these people you knew from your former days at Procter & Gamble? Or?
Yeah, some of them. So, I started, of course, with people that I knew, but the last question I typically ask in any of my interviews is, now that you know what I'm looking for, who do you think I should talk to? And that, of course, turns out, oh, Bob in accounting, or Jane in sales, or, Sally the procurement, you got to talk to her, So, yeah, I end up getting more of my interviews that way. But yeah, so the process, the research. Of course, I typically read all the other books that have been written on the topic, or as many as I can get through. But most of it is these primary interviews that I do with these people all over the world, and I end up reverse engineering my way into what makes for a compelling story. But one of the questions I was asking them, to kind of get back to the other question, is when are you using storytelling in the sales process? And of course, I found out what their sales process is. And it turns out everybody's got different names for their parts of the sales process. You could probably articulate right now what your sales process is, and the names that you use for those parts would be different than people at other companies would use, but they're all pretty similar. And I mean, and it starts from as early as identifying who your prospect is that you want to sell to building rapport with the buyer, to making the actual sales pitch itself, to resolving objections, to negotiating price, to closing the sale, to service after the sale. I mean, that probably sounds familiar to you.
Right, there's a cycle.
Yeah, so the kind of storytelling I'm talking about happens in all of those parts, not just the main sales pitch. So the best salespeople that I interviewed were starting their storytelling the minute they met somebody, and it would be a story to help introduce themselves, to help the prospect understand who I am, what I'm about, what it is that I do for a living. Then there's the rapport building, then the actual sales pitch itself. And yes, there should be 2 or 3 stories out of a 30-minute sales call. 7 or 8 minutes of that probably ought to be in storytelling, and the other 23 minutes could be normal sales pitch type stuff. But then I found great salespeople actually using storytelling to negotiate price, to resolve objections in a really creative way, and actually closing the sale by creating more of a sense of urgency, and some really creative uses of storytelling after the sale was made to build loyalty and get people to be happy with the purchase decision they've made. And now that I'm doing business with you, you want me to stay happy, right? And storytelling can help there too. So I was really just pleasantly surprised at all the uses of storytelling throughout the entire sales process.
And why is storytelling so powerful? Why does that convince somebody to buy when they wouldn't have otherwise?
Yeah. So there are a lot of reasons. My top few I would tell you is, first of all, it turns out that human beings don't make decisions as logically and rationally as we think we do, right? We like to think we're these logical, rational thinking machines, but the truth is, and that cognitive science that's been done tells us this, that human beings make subconscious, emotional, sometimes irrational decisions in one place in their brain, and then they justify that logically and rationally in a different place in their brain after the fact. But that's the conscious part that we remember, so that's why we think that we're so rational. But the truth is, our decisions were made 0.3 of a second earlier in the subconscious part. Facts and logic and data only talk to that conscious, logical, rational part of the brain. They don't talk to the subconscious, emotional part of the brain. Stories do.
So you need both.
Right? You need both, yeah. So I'm definitely not an advocate of abandoning your logical, rational sales pitch for a story. That would be foolish. Now, I recommend this as something in addition to. So out of a 30-minute sales call, instead of having 30 minutes of sales pitch, traditional logic-only sales pitch, you ought to have 2 or 3 stories in there to speak to both parts of the brain. I think you'll be more effective that way.
Was there a point in your career when this topic really became more important for you and you decided, hey, I'm going to write a book on this? Like lead with a story, for example?
Yeah, so I was probably 15 years into my career when I guess it finally dawned on me that storytelling is important. I mean, they didn't teach me that in business school. Nobody told me that when I joined P&G or joined Arthur Andersen. It just finally dawned on me. The leaders that I admired the most and wanted to work for or be like when I grew up in the company were great storytellers. And so once I realized that, then I set out trying to learn how to do it. And it was kind of hard because there's not a lot of classes. You can't just go up to the local community college and take a class on storytelling, or at least in most places you can't. And if you do, it's certainly not in the business school, right? It's in the creative arts department, but I don't want to learn to be a fiction novelist. I mean, that's not the kind of storytelling that I was interested in learning. I was interested in learning the 2-minute type of story, but that was nonfiction, real stories. And so that's when I set out interviewing CEOs and leaders all over the world, just on my own personal learning journey. And that just ended up turning into a book. I guess I finally decided, gosh, if I want to know this badly, probably other people do as well. And so it became a book idea as well.
Okay, and so you wrote this book while you were working at Procter & Gamble. What was the point where you decided, hey, this is a popular book, maybe I should go out and do this full time?
Oh, Yeah, well, so it kind of was in that order. I didn't know for sure that I was going to leave and make a career of it, but I did get fortunate, and it's allowed me to do that. But yeah, there was one moment where I really had to make a decision. Right? Do I keep working at my day job? And I was 45 or 46 years old at the time, so too young for retirement, and I got kids to get through college and all that stuff. So it was a really tough decision. And I actually ended up asking my father for advice. He's 80 years old at the time, and I figured you're never too old to learn from somebody older and wiser. And he's hard of hearing, so I can't call him on the phone anymore. So I literally write him a letter, and he writes back. And I thought he was just going to give me advice. Oh, absolutely, son, you should go, pursue your dream. Or he was going to tell me, are you nuts? Right? I mean, stick it out for 5 more years and retire, and then go play around with the stuff. But he didn't do either of those things. He literally, ironically, told me a story about himself that I'd never heard before, and that none of my siblings had ever heard either. And he said, when I was 5 years old, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. He said, I wanted to be a singer, like a Frank Sinatra or Tony Bennett. I mean, he's 80, that's his genre, right? And he said, and I knew that the first day of kindergarten. He said, I get there and the teacher asks if any of us have any special talent, like dancing or magic tricks or whatever. And he said, I raised my hand and I said, I can sing. Despite the fact that he'd never sung in front of anybody but his mom in the kitchen, right? And so, of course, what do you think she does when he says that?
I'll sing us a song.
Of course, Bobby, stand up and sing us a song. So little 5-year-old Bobby stands up and he says, I belted out my favorite song right there, a cappella, in front of everybody. And he said, I nailed it. Right?
Wow.
I got all the words right and the melody and everything, and I was so proud. And he said, and the teacher and the other students stood up and they applauded me. Like my first standing ovation, my first time to ever sing a song. And he said, that's the moment that I knew that this is what I was destined to do with my life. And he said, unfortunately, that turned out not just to be the first time in my life that I ever sang in front of an audience. It turned out to be the last time I ever sang in front of an audience. And he said, the truth is, son, it wasn't just that life got in the way. I never had the courage to pursue it. And he said, that was 75 years ago. And there's not a month that goes by that I don't regret that decision. He said, someday you're going to wake up, you're going to be 80 years old like me. It's going to be too late for you to pursue your dream. Right. And if that wasn't enough, and it was, by the way, if that wasn't enough, I kid you not, he closed the letter with these words. He said, I'd love to see you achieve your dream, but that doesn't mean in your lifetime, son. That means in mine. And I mean, TikTok, right? I mean, these guys 80.
Put a little pressure on you there.
Yeah. So literally, 2 days later, I walked into my boss's office, Kirk Perry at Google, walked into my boss's office, and I resigned from my 20-year career to pursue this dream. And It's absolutely been the best decision ever made. And I probably would have made that decision eventually, but I wouldn't have made it on that day or that week or that month if it was not for that story from my dad.
And you mentioned that story also inspired your boss, Kirk Perry, right?
I think it did. You need to have him on here and have that conversation as well. But yeah, you may not have had the pleasure of him working here quite as soon, maybe, if it wasn't for that. But
that's
we'll
great.
See. Yeah.
Well, we're glad to have him.
Yeah.
You've interviewed people all over the world, as you mentioned. Are there cultures or types of people that are better storytellers than others? Naturally, maybe? Yeah, so 2 parts of that. First of all, definitely there are cultural differences in storytelling. And in some places, people just do it a lot more. I think of in Latin America, there's a lot more storytelling that just happens culturally than in Eastern Europe and or maybe in Western Europe, in Germany, for example. So there are definitely places where it's more accepted and expected as part of even in business interactions. But there's also definitely people who are naturally gifted storytellers and some people who are not. And one of the things I learned as I interviewed these people all over the world, obviously I learned that. But what I also learned is that if you're not one of those people who's naturally good at it, you can still learn it. And that's, in fact, one of the misconceptions that I found a lot of people have is they think that some people are just born a natural storyteller or they're not, and if they're not, they'll just never be. And I find it to be like art or music. Like some people are natural born musicians or artists, and by the way, I'm neither of those things. But I bet if I wanted to learn to play the guitar, if I took lessons for 6 months, I could probably learn. Now, I'm never going to be fabulous, but I could probably strum out a few songs, right? But with storytelling, people just, and most people know that. Most people know if I really wanted to be an artist or musician, I could learn it a little bit. But a lot of people assume with storytelling, oh no, I'm just not one of those people. It's so tough for me. No, that's exactly why I write these books. I mean, you can learn this just like you can learn any art, but you can't just wing it. You can't just say, today I'm going to be a good storyteller. I'm just going to practice more.
what does it say? Practice. You can't just practice playing the piano and assume you're going to get good. You need to learn from somebody who knows what they're doing, right? So read a book, take a class, whatever, and that's the whole purpose of this. This is a learnable skill, and you should learn it.
So to give us a preview of some of the techniques you teach in here, what are some of the ways you can learn to be a good storyteller?
Yeah.
Give us a couple of frameworks or something?
Yeah, so first of all, the structure of a story matters, right? And all stories have some kind of a structure, and if you know what that is, you can craft a better story. And there are lots of different story structures you can use, but the kind of stories that you tell at work, that you should be telling at work, either for leadership purposes or sales purposes, are short. So I found that the average sales story is 2 minutes long. The average leadership story is 4 minutes long. Okay, I didn't say 10 or 15 or 20, right? And so when people are telling 10, 15, 20-minute stories around the office, most people are yawning and rolling their eyes and checking their watch, right? And looking for an exit strategy, right? So these are short, to the point stories. So you don't have time for a 17-step story structure, right? You need a short one. So what I advocate in the book is it's 4 steps. It's context, challenge, conflict, and resolution, right? So you introduce your main character. They're already into the very next part is what happened, what was the problem that they ran into, or the opportunity that they ran into. What did they do about it? And then how did it turn out in the end? That's essentially it. In fact, there are 8 questions that I say your story needs to answer these 8 questions in this order, right? And it starts with, why should I listen to the story, right? Because if you don't answer that question, they might not. I mean, they could either mentally or emotionally or physically check out. But then you get into the, where and when did it happen? Who's the main character? What did they want? What was that problem they ran into? What did they do about it? How did it turn out in the end? And the last couple of questions after the story is technically done is, what did you learn from it? And what do you think I should do now? Right, and if you can answer those 8 questions in that order, you've got a pretty decent story on your hand. Now, I think there are a lot of things you can add to that to take a good story and make it a great story, like emotion that you mentioned. The element of surprise is a really important one, even in business stories and leadership stories and sales stories. Adding a dialogue really makes it feel like a story instead of somebody reading the tax manual to you. And so there and some level of details, but not too much. I mean, if I were to start out a story with you by saying, well, it was a warm September morning, right, and the leaves were just turning color in the fall, and that, like, already you're like, oh, are you serious, right?
What's going on?
Yeah, I mean that's like a 19th century romance novel, right? Which is appropriate if you're reading a 19th century romance novel. But if somebody's telling a story around the office, that's not an appropriate level of detail. That's way too much detail, and the wrong detail. Like, that's irrelevant to what's going on. So those are the kind of things that you want, the right kind of detail and dialogue and emotion and surprise. So you combine all those kind of things, and there's a chapter essentially on each of those in the book to walk you through what the appropriate amount of that stuff is.
I remember in the book you said there's a difference between a journalistic story, like a headline in a newspaper with the inverted pyramid, and a business story. Can you tell us a little bit about that difference? Yeah,
good question. Yeah, so that's one of those story structures that does not work, because it's really not a story structure, it's an article structure. Yeah, so journalists are often taught to start with the lead, which is, 4 people killed in roadside bomb, in wherever, and then all the details follow, right? But in storytelling, you don't do that. You don't start out your story with, and Romeo and Juliet died. Now let me tell you their story. You've ruined the story.
No element of surprise.
Right, yeah. I mean, stories are not newspaper articles. I mean, they're very different. I mean, people call a newspaper article a newspaper story sometimes, but there again, I think that creates some confusion. So newspaper articles and really business memos are patterned the same as newspaper articles with the inverted pyramid. I mean, if you're going to write a memo around the office or an email, you probably do, and you probably should start out, I recommend we do this. And here are my reasons why. Here's the research I did, and here are my conclusions, and which all serves to promote and justify the recommendation you made at the very top, right? That's normal. But that's not a story. That's a memo. That's an email. That's a recommendation. A story is very different. A story starts out context, action, result. Surprise ending is at the end. The lesson that you learned is at the very end, right? And you can use a story within the context of one of those memos or a speech or a presentation. But you would never start a story with, and Luke Skywalker, is the son of Darth Vader. And let me tell you what happened to them. Well, again, you've ruined the whole story. Right? So different story structure.
Okay. So for someone that's not used to telling stories in a sales meeting, how do you launch into that? Do you say, I'd like to tell you a story, and go into that, or what's the best approach?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, never do that, right? That's the worst thing you can do is, all right, boys and girls, gather around. It's story time, right? I mean, that's if you're selling to a bunch of kindergartners, yes, you can do that. But probably you're selling to grown-ups. And grown-ups don't want to or need to be told that they're going to be told a story. In fact, a lot of people have a negative, visceral reaction to hearing that, right? I mean, in fact, if we had started this meeting with you saying, okay, let's go ahead and start this meeting, and I thought I'd kick it off by telling you a story. I mean, immediately your audience is probably, their eyes are starting to roll in the back of their heads already, right? I mean, because what they're imagining is you telling some long, boring, 15-minute, irrelevant story. So the way to start out is with what I call the hook. And there's a whole chapter in the book just on how to craft that hook, but it's literally only a half a sentence or maybe a sentence or two. And so it's more like something like, that's a really tough problem. Let me tell you what I did last year when I ran into that problem. And now you're telling a story. Or, God, that's a tough question. I think the best example of that I've ever seen was, and now you're telling a story. So it's literally a one-sentence lead-in that tells the audience, I'm going to tell you something that's very important to you. So, and here goes. As opposed to being told, I'm going to tell you a story. Just that word story is really never going to serve you well when you're telling a story.
Oh, yeah, great advice. There's a particular story in this book that you share about a sales team that brings in their vice president, and he damages the relationship to some extent.
Yeah.
Could you share a little bit about that story with us, or maybe retell it?
Yeah. So what happened was this a company was calling on a retailer, and the manufacturer had raised their prices, and it upset the retailer. They were upset about the increase in prices, and they wanted to essentially yell at somebody from headquarters, somebody important, right? So bring out one of your executives so that we can chew them out and tell them how unhappy we are with this price increase. And so this guy, whose fictitious name in the story is Bob Jacobson, gets called out from headquarters to go on this to this sales meeting. And he's there, and the meeting's going pretty well. There was some yelling and screaming, and there was a lot of tension in the room. But when it was all over, it ended nicely, and nobody, they didn't get kicked out of distribution, and the relationship wasn't spoiled, and everything actually ended pretty well. Bob pulls out his business card and hands it to the buyer, the client, and said, look, this relationship is really important to me. So here's my card. Feel free to call me directly anytime. Sometimes things can get lost in translation. I just want you to know that I'm here for you whenever. And then the meeting was over, and everybody went home. And he, of course, thought he had done this great job and had saved the relationship with this client at the end, this retailer. And they're debriefing with the rest. He's debriefing with the rest of the sales team after it's over. And he said, well, that went pretty well, didn't it? And they looked at him like he was from Mars. They're like, well, yeah, Bob, it was going great until the end where you handed your business card to the buyer and basically told them that we were a bunch of idiots that couldn't even pass along a message to headquarters without something getting lost in translation. Like, you basically cost us, that 10 seconds cost us 6 months of equity that we've had to develop with that client. It'll take us another 6 months to earn it back, right? And so he thought he had done this wonderful job, but he'd really totally thrown the whole team under the bus and learned a valuable lesson and ended up losing his job over it, right? But he won't make that mistake again.
Right.
Yeah.
So tell us, in the trainings you do, keynote presentations, you do trainings, what type of work do you do with the clients you work with?
Yeah. So teaching them how to use storytelling better is, I guess, the obvious solution. And by the way, that story that I just told you, that's story type number 25, right? It's one of the types of stories that you would tell not to a buyer and not to yourself, but to your peers. It's the type of story you would tell about that sales call you went on that went great or went awfully, so that they can learn from it. So that's just one of the types of storytelling. Yeah. So typically, I mean, I'll do keynotes that could be in front of a large audience of 1,000 people or something. But more typically, I'm with a small group of 15 to 30, 35 people for a whole day. Right, teaching them the real nuts and bolts of how do you use storytelling, how do you craft stories for leadership purposes or sales purposes, and we walk through all of the components of the story structure, and then the use of emotion, and how do you use the element of surprise, and the right dialogue and details, and basically have modules and a case study that I go through on each of these, and they'll often bring in their own stories as well, and we'll work on those so they can see how they take what was an okay story, or maybe not even a story at all, and we turn it into a great story by the end of the day.
Okay, that sounds great. Do you see storytelling as becoming a more serious business topic, maybe being taught in business schools in the future, or what is the situation with that now?
Yeah, I hope so. In fact, I think it is. So like when I was in business school 20 some odd years ago, it was definitely not. But I've heard that there are a handful of schools that are beginning to teach this. And in fact, I know that one of my books is being used as a text in several classes, maybe not the only text, but so I know that's beginning to happen. So it's definitely a more seriously sought after skill now.
Yeah, great. I think we're going to see if there's any questions from the group here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does anyone here have any questions for Paul about storytelling, business storytelling?
Paul, you mentioned, at least from your intro, that you had led these research teams for quite a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, putting together those custom analysis, I imagine those are somewhat long stories. You know, there's not just necessarily one point to draw out of that. So can you tell us a little bit about how you saw that transition to this short 2 to 4 minute story from this detailed world that you lived in?
Yeah, so the question is about research and analysis, how to turn that into stories. And so if I could clarify a little bit, so I'm not suggesting that you take an entire analysis and turn it into 1 2-minute story. I'm suggesting that if you may have a 1-hour presentation to present the results of your analysis, well, you should use all of that you need. And you should 2 or 3 times within that hour, you should use a 2 or 3 minute story. And so I'm not talking about replacing an entire hour of analysis and presentation with one story, but illustrating it throughout with some of those. And I think if I could answer another question that's probably buried in there is how do you tell a story with data? Because it's probably a lot of the world that you traffic in are numbers. And I think you can tell stories with data as well. So for example, at one point I had done an analysis of 40 years worth of sales and profit data in one of the P&G businesses that I was working on. And I found a very interesting correlation in that the first 20 some odd years of this data, there was a very strong correlation between sales and profit. But for the next 20 years, there was no relationship whatsoever, zero correlation between sales and profit, which led me to some very interesting conclusions and led me to a very specific recommendation that I wanted to make. And normally what I was taught to do is go in, tell them, I recommend that we do this, and here's my reason why, and here's the data that supports it. And by the way, here's the correlation chart that shows the data. But that's not what I did. I used a story. Essentially, I used the data as a story. I showed them the data, showed them the first 20 years of correlation, and then I showed them the second 20 years. And it was very clear that the relationship changed. And then I just asked them, what do you think happened around 1983 that forever changed the relationship between sales and profits in this industry? And I let them struggle with that question. And they started throwing out answers. Well, is that when this happened, or did this happen, or did this happen? It was like, good answer, but no, good answer, but no, good answer, but no. Somebody got it. The same answer that I came up with. I said, yeah, that's it. And then as soon as that happened, it was like magic. Everybody in the room just went, oh. And right after that, all of my conclusions started coming out of their mouths. And right after that, my recommendations started coming out of their mouths. Like I literally never got to my recommendation slide. And it was the best recommendation, the most quickly adhered to and agreed to recommendation that I ever didn't make at P&G, right? Because walking them through that as a story, like and I call that now a discovery journey story, where you walk the audience through the analysis that you did in the order that you did it, up to the point that you had your big aha moment, but then stop and let them have the aha moment, because then it's their idea. And you know that people are more passionate about pursuing their idea than they are about your idea, right? So using a discovery journey story with data that way turns your idea into their idea.
So what was the reason?
Well, the reason was because the market had matured. So it was the business was disposable diapers like Pampers and Loves. And when it was invented, of course, it was replacing cloth diapers. And it took about 20 years for people to stop using cloth diapers, and pretty much all diapering households adopted disposable diapers. So once that 20 years had expired and nobody was using cloth diapers anymore, the market stopped growing and it flattened out. That point was a pivotal moment that strategies change, right? The strategies that will be successful in a developing market are very different than in a mature market. and we just hadn't noticed that, and so that's what made the difference. But I waited for somebody to figure that out, and it didn't take long, 2 or 3 minutes, but that was such a well-invested 2 or 3 minutes, as opposed to me just giving them the answer, because, like I said, then it became their idea.
Great.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So the minute that your dad wrote you this letter and you decided you're going to make this transition, how did you materialize? So you resigned, and then did you just set out to be an author? Did you want to be a speaker, or how did your post P&G career develop?
Yeah, so it was a little bit intentional. I mean, I knew that I wanted to be a speaker and trainer. I enjoyed that, and I did a fair amount of that at P&G, and I thought it would be great if I could do this full time. I didn't know that I would enjoy being an author and enjoy writing, but it turns out I did. But I only found that out after I tried it. And so I thought, well, how cool is that? I found two things that I love. Yes, so that absolutely correct.
Oh, okay.
Well, but being a writer kind of goes along with that.
Sure.
I mean, like if I didn't do all this research and write books and nobody would know about me, I wouldn't have anything interesting to share, right? So it's kind of this strange business model where you go do research and write books, and then people hire you to go teach them and train them about it, because look, we don't have 6 weeks to read your book. We want to know right now, right? So come in 8 hours, teach us all of this. So yeah, I knew I wanted to do that, but I kind of had to wait and to see if there was some success with the first book, because quite frankly, like my dad said, I didn't have the courage to just quit and say, I'm going to write a book someday. I played it a little bit safe, I'll admit. I wrote the book first and then kind of waited to see what happened.
Good. Well, if that's all the questions we have for now, I think we'll wrap it up. Paul, thank you so much for telling us about this book, Sell with a Story, and learning about how storytelling and the power it has in business and in life. We appreciate you being here with us.
No, you're welcome. It's very good to be here.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks.